There is a drawer in the National Archives that should not be empty. It is labeled in faded ink, tucked between thousands of other files, each one documenting a life, a name, a place in time. But when you pull it open, there is almost nothing inside. Just fragments, torn pages, water-stained paper that looks like it survived something it was never meant to. Now imagine something worse. Imagine that drawer once held the identities of 63 million people, not stories, not myths, real individuals, families, entire bloodlines, recorded in precise detail during a single moment in American history. A snapshot of a generation that stood between what came before and what was about to disappear, and now almost all of it is gone. You are told it was a fire, a routine accident in a government building, smoke, water damage, bureaucratic oversight, a slow decay of documents no one bothered to preserve. That is the explanation repeated in textbooks, genealogy forums, official archives. But here is what they do not tell you. The fire did not erase those records. Time did not erase those records. People did. Decisions were made. Authorizations were signed, and what survived the flames was quietly finished off years later when no one was paying attention. Because that drawer is not just empty, it is specific, it marks a boundary. A line in history where millions of Americans can trace their names back to, and then suddenly cannot go any further. Not to 1776, not to 1620, but to a far more uncomfortable place. 1870, that is where your family history stops being a story and starts becoming silence. But is there air 2-1 to 1? All? And once you see that pattern, once you realize that almost everyone hits the exact same wall, you are forced to ask a question that is much harder to ignore than a missing document. Start with the number they want you to ignore. Not a small number, not a rounding error in history. 63 million. That is how many people were recorded in the United States Census of 1890. The most detailed census ever conducted up to that point. The most how-wind, not just names and ages, but immigration status, naturalization, how many children a woman had given birth to versus how many survived, whether a person could speak English, whether they owned their home or rented it, even which side they fought on during the Civil War. This was not just a record, it was a complete snapshot of a population standing at a turning point, the last generation that still remembered what came before 1870. And that is exactly why it matters. Because if you were trying to understand who Americans were before that invisible wall, this is the one document you would need. Now listen carefully to what happened to it. On January 10, 1921, a fire broke out in the basement of the Commerce Building in Washington, District of Columbia, where these records were stored. The official explanation is simple. 1/4 of the census was destroyed immediately. Another half was damaged by water and smoke. Case closed. Except it is not. Because what the official version leaves out is what happened next. Those damaged records were not restored. They were not copied. They were not prioritized. They were left for 12 years. 12 years of silence. In 12 years where 63 million lives sat in storage, slowly deteriorating, while the institution responsible for preserving them did nothing. And then, in December of 1932, something happened that almost no one talks about. The chief clerk of the Census Bureau sent a list to the Librarian of Congress. A routine request on paper. It asked which damaged documents were worth saving and which could be destroyed. The census of 1890 was on that list. And the response? Not partial preservation, not selective recovery. 0. Not a single page from 63 million names was deemed worth keeping. Congress approved the destruction on February 21, 1933. And here is where the timeline stops being coincidence. One day later, February 22, 1933, President Herbert Hoover laid the cornerstone for the National Archives building, a fireproof facility designed specifically to prevent the loss of historical records like this ever happening again. One day apart, the destruction of the most important census in American history and the beginning of a building that would have saved it. Out of 63 million names, approximately 6,000 survived. 6,000, that is not loss, that is selection. And once you understand that, the question changes, because this is no longer about a fire. It is about why the only document that could bridge the gap between your known ancestors and everything before 1870 was the one that disappeared. Now step away from the federal level. because even if the national records were compromised, you would expect the local ones to fill the gaps. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, land deeds, probate documents, the kinds of records stored in courthouses across thousands of counties, the physical proof of who lived, who owned, who married, and who existed. But this is where the pattern becomes harder to ignore. There is a term genealogists use. They call them burned counties. At first, it sounds like an unfortunate detail of the past. Wooden buildings, oil lamps, accidental fires in an era before modern infrastructure, but look at the numbers. Approximately 40% of counties in Alabama lost their records, around 40% of Georgia, nearly 40% of Mississippi, and in Tennessee, 60 out of 95 counties experienced significant record destruction. That is not occasional. That is systematic, and in some places, it happened more than once. Lenoir County, North Carolina, lost records in 1878, and then again in 1880. Montgomery County burned in 1835, then 1840, then again in 1886. Swain County lost everything in 1879, and then, decades later, in 1908, a mob burned the courthouse during a riot, ensuring nothing remained. Even entire towns were erased from relevance. Port Tobacco, Maryland, experienced what contemporary accounts described as a suspicious fire in 1895. The courthouse was completely destroyed. The town never recovered its status and faded into obscurity. Now ask yourself something simple. Why do these fires keep targeting the exact buildings that hold identity? Not factories, not warehouses, but courthouses, the one place where every piece of your existence is documented. Birth, death, marriage, property, inheritance, everything that connects you to the past. Some researchers have a term for this pattern. They call it paper genocide, because when you destroy the documents that prove who people are, you do not just lose history, you erase it. And in some cases, there were witnesses, reports of courthouse employees removing specific documents before the fires began, records that did not burn because they were taken, stored somewhere else, private collections locked away, unavailable to the descendants who would need them to reconstruct their own lineage. But even without fire, there was another problem. Most people were never documented in the first place. Before the early 1900s, birth certificates were not consistently required across the United States. Massachusetts began recording births in 1841, but South Carolina did not mandate birth registration until 1915. Georgia waited until 1919. Texas began in 1903, but compliance was inconsistent for decades, which means millions of Americans were born with no official record that they existed. And when Social Security began in 1935, the system exposed that gap. Millions of people could not prove their own birth, no certificate, no government documentation, so they were asked to do something almost impossible, to prove they were real. They filed what were called delayed birth certificates, assembling whatever fragments they could find. Census entries, church baptism records, notes written in family Bibles, testimony from elderly relatives. Imagine that for a moment. An entire generation required to reconstruct their identity from scattered pieces of evidence, and even then, nothing was guaranteed. Because those pieces were fragile. A Bible could be lost, a church could burn, a witness could die, and just like that, a person disappears from the official record. Not because they never existed, but because the proof was never allowed to survive. Now return to the year that keeps appearing like a boundary marker. 1870. Because something happened in that year that changed the structure of identity itself in American records. 4 million people appeared, not born that year, not newly arrived, but documented, by name, for the first time. Formerly enslaved Americans. Before 1870, they were not listed as individuals in federal census records. They appeared as marks on a page, age, gender, a number in a column under someone else's name. The censuses of 1850 and 1860 even included separate documents called slave schedules, where human beings were recorded as property. No names, no family connections, no traceable lineage. And then, suddenly, in 1870, names, but not stable ones. Because millions of people had to choose surnames for the first time. Some took the names of former enslavers. Others chose entirely new identities: Freeman, Liberty, Justice, Hope, names that reflected a transformation rather than a past. And here is where the system fractures. The same person might appear under one surname in the census and another in church records. A father might adopt one name while his children carried another. A family line could split, merge, and disappear within a single generation of documentation. It was necessary for survival. But for genealogy, it created a maze with no map, an entire population whose documented history begins at the exact same moment, with the exact same instability, and they were not the only ones missing from earlier records. If your ancestors arrived in America before 1820, there is likely no official record of their entry, because the federal government did not require passenger manifests until the Steerage Act of 1819 took effect in 1820. Before that, immigration records depended on colonial ports, many of which kept incomplete logs, or none at all. Historians estimate that approximately 80% of white immigrants before 1790 came from British territories and were never formally documented, which means millions of people who built the foundations of the country left no paper trail of how they got there. Now step back and look at the pattern as a whole. Before 1820, no arrival records. Before 1870, millions without names. Before the early 1900s, millions without birth certificates. The census of 1890, the one document that could connect all of it, reduced from 63 million names to 6,000. Local courthouse records, destroyed across nearly half of entire regions. Every path that leads backward is broken, and then you reach the present. The records that remain, the fragments, the pieces, the surviving threads, are not freely scattered. They are centralized. The largest genealogical archive in the world is maintained by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Their system, known as Family Search, stores over 2 billion names inside the Granite Mountain Records Vault in Utah, a facility carved into solid rock, engineered to withstand catastrophe. A nuclear-proof archive holding the identities of the past, maintained not for public transparency, but for a religious doctrine, baptism for the dead. In parallel, the most widely used platform for tracing Ancestry was built on those same foundational records, originating from Brigham Young University connections, later acquired by a private equity firm for billions, and integrated with the same underlying data systems. So consider the full structure. The past is fragmented. The bridge to it was destroyed. The local backups were burned, and what remains is concentrated, accessible but controlled. And that brings us back to the question that has been building beneath every detail, not whether records were lost, but whether the loss followed a design. So now you are left with something uncomfortable, not a missing record, not an incomplete database, but a pattern. A pattern where every path leading backward disappears at the same point. A pattern where the one generation that could have explained everything was documented in unprecedented detail and then removed. A pattern where the local records that might have filled the gaps burned, sometimes more than once, sometimes under circumstances people at the time already questioned, and what remains is just enough to keep you searching, just enough to convince you that if you dig a little deeper, subscribe to one more database, upload one more document, you might finally break through that wall. But you never do, because the wall is not where you think it is. It is not in your effort. It is not in your research skills. It is in the structure itself. Before 1870, millions had no names in official records. Before 1820, millions arrived with no documentation. Before standardized birth registration, millions were never recorded at all. And the one moment where all of those threads could have been tied together was reduced from 63 million names to 6,000. You are told this is how history works. Messy, incomplete, full of gaps. But here is the question that does not go away. If you wanted to disconnect an entire population from its own past, not by force, not by announcement, but quietly, through paperwork, through neglect, through decisions that look ordinary on the surface, would it look any different than this? Because your family tree does not begin in 1870, that is simply where the paper trail was cut. Everything before that exists somewhere else, in stories that were never written down, in names that changed before they could be recorded, in places that no longer match the maps you are shown today, and those stories are disappearing, not in a fire, not through legislation, but through time. The generation that still remembers is fading, and when they are gone, the only thing left will be what is written in official records. Records that already tell you nothing existed before a certain point. So here is the question you have to decide for yourself. When the only version of history that survives is the one that cannot be verified, are you looking at the truth or the result of something that was never meant to be seen?